The heat swelled through the thick coats of the Union soldiers during that late August summer of 1863. You see, the fate of the Western theater of the American Civil War now seemingly hinges on that of a single city, Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Black Railroad hub nestled among mountains and rivers. It was more than a town, you see. It was a gateway. Converged there, connecting the deep south and the Mississippi, even the East Coast, to the Confederacy's heartland. You see, people on both sides knew that whoever controlled Chattanooga controlled the movement, supply lines, and ultimately the direction of the war in the Deep South. On August 16th of 1863, Major General William S. Rosecrans set his army in motion. Commanding the Union Army of the Cumberland, he launched a campaign designed not simply to seize Chattanooga, but to do so through maneuver rather than a direct assault. You see, his strategy and, well, any hopes of a Union victory here relied primarily on deception. John T. Wilder and his brigade played a key role. Moving northeast of Chattanooga, they made themselves highly visible to Confederate General Braxton Bragg. The display was deliberate. You see, it suggested that the Union Army intended to strike from that direction. A few days later, on August 21st, Wilder's artillery opened fire across the Tennessee River. Captain Eli Lilly's battery shelled the city, catching soldiers and civilians alike during a day of prayer. Steamers were sunk. Panic spread, and Bragg's attention was fixed firmly to the northeast. Meanwhile, General Rosecrans executed his true plan. His army crossed the river far to the west and south, slipping into position undetected. By September 8th, Bragg realized the danger he was in. Rather than risk encirclement, he abandoned Chattanooga and withdrew into northern Georgia. The Union had taken the city without a major fight, but the campaign was far from over. Rosecrans pursued Bragg aggressively, and the two armies collided at the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia, on September 19th through September 20th. There, a devastating mistake by Rosecrans opened a gap in the Union line. Lieutenant General James Longstreet seized on the opportunity, driving through with crushing force and routing much of the Union Army. Only the steadfast defense of Major General George H. Thomas, earning him the nickname of Rock of Chickamauga, prevented total destruction of the Union Army. The battered Union Army retreated back to Chattanooga. Bragg followed this time. He would not let the opportunity slip away again. Once inside Chattanooga, Rosecrans' army found itself trapped. You see, Bragg positioned his forces on the surrounding heights, Missionary Ridge, Lookout, and Signal Mountain, overlooking the city and controlling its now supply lines. The Union Army was effectively besieged. Conditions deteriorated quickly. Food ran short. Horses and mules died in large numbers. Supplies had to be hauled over a tortuous 60-mile route through rough terrain, often under threat from Confederate cavalry led by Joseph Wheeler. Morale, it plummeted. Soldiers received only meager rations every few days, often having to resort to eating the wild animals found roaming the streets. Rosecrans himself seemed paralyzed by the defeat at Chickamauga. President Abraham Lincoln remarked that he appeared confused and stunned like a duck hit on the head. Meanwhile, Bragg's position, however, though strong, was far from stable. You see, his army was plagued by internal disputes. Several of his senior generals petitioned Jefferson Davis to remove him. Though Davis chose to ultimately retain Bragg, the infighting weakened Confederate effectiveness at a critical moment in the war. Some relief came in the form of Major General Ulysses S. Grant. On October 17th, he was placed in command of the newly created Military Division of the Mississippi, giving him authority over all Union forces in the Western Theater. Grant acted decisively. He removed Rosecrans and replaced him with George H. Thomas, who immediately vowed to hold Chattanooga till we starve. Grant's first priority, however, was not to attack. However, it was to feed his army. Solution came from Brigadier General William F. Baldy Smith, Chief Engineer of the Army of the Cumberland. His plan was bold. You see, open a new, shorter supply line along the Tennessee River. On October 27th, Brigadier General William B. Hazen led a stealthy nighttime operation. His men floated silently downstream on pontoons, landing at Brown's Ferry Road, under cover of darkness and fog. They seized the heights before Confederate forces could even react. A supporting force under Brigadier General John B. Turchin moved into position, and soon Joseph Hooker's troops linked up with Lookout Valley. The Cracker Line was now open. For the Union Army, it was a lifeline. Food and supplies began to flow, and the siege was effectively broken. So General Bragg ordered Longstreet to strike back. On the night of October 28th through the 29th, Longstreet launched a rare nighttime attack against Hooker's forces near Wauhatchie. Confederate troops under Vander M. Law and Micah Jenkins struck the isolated division of John W. Geary. Fighting erupted in darkness and confusion. Geary's men held their ground despite heavy pressure and the death of Geary's son during the battle. Hooker's reinforcements, though delayed and mismanaged, eventually forced the Confederates to withdraw from the area. The Cracker Line remained secure. With their supplies restored, Grant prepared to strike. He developed a coordinated plan with Thomas and Smith. William T. Sherman would attack the Confederate right flank, Thomas would pin the center, and Hooker would strike the left at a Lookout Mountain. But Bragg misread the situation. Believing Sherman was moving towards Knoxville, he weakened his own army, sending Longstreet and later additional troops away. His defensive line along Missionary Ridge became dangerously thin. So the battle begins, actually by accident. On November 23rd, General Thomas sent troops under Thomas J. Wood forward in a reconnaissance mission. What followed was far more than just a probe. 14,000 Union soldiers surged forward and captured Orchard Knob, overwhelming the small Confederate contingency. Grant seized the opportunity, and Orchard Knob became his new headquarters. The next day, Hooker attacked Lookout Mountain. What began as a demonstration turned into a full frontal assault. Union troops under John W. Geary advanced along the slopes, pushing back Confederates under Edward Warthall. Thick fog enveloped the battlefield, creating the now infamous Battle Above the Corrals scene. By nightfall, Bragg abandoned the mountain, and by the next day, it fell to Union hands. The final day would decide everything for the battle. Sherman attacked the Confederate right near Tunnel Hill, Georgia, but was repulsed by the determined defense of Patrick R. Cleburne. Hooker, delayed by burned bridges, eventually advanced to Rossville Gap, only about 5 miles away, threatening the Confederate flank. In the center, Grant ordered Thomas to make limited attack on the rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. Thomas's men succeeded, but then something unexplained happened. You see, without orders, they just kept going. That night, General Bragg withdrew to Dalton, Georgia. Union pursuit was limited. At Ringgold Gap, on November 27th, Patrick Cleburne made a final stand. With only 4,100 men, he held off Joseph Hooker's much larger force for 5 hours, allowing the Confederate Army to fully escape. The Union had won a decisive victory that day. Chattanooga remained firmly in Union hands, and Tennessee was effectively secured. The city became a base for future operations, including Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Confederate morale collapsed. Bragg resigned command and was placed by Joseph E. Johnson. Grant's success at Chattanooga elevated him to overall supreme command of all Union armies. The Battle of Chattanooga was more than just a victory. It was a turning point. What began as a desperate struggle for survival ended in a sweeping triumph. Through leadership, logistics, and determination, the Union transformed defeat into dominance. From the heights of Lookout Mountain to the slopes of Missionary Ridge, the campaign demonstrated that the war in the West had shifted decisively, and that the road into the Deep South now was wide open. On a cold November morning in 1863, the ridgelines outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee were shrouded in a haze of gunpowder smoke and winter mist. Below the heights of Missionary Ridge, Union soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland waited in tense formation, staring upward at a seemingly impregnable Confederate position. The ridge rose sharply from the valley floor, its crest lined with entrenched Southern troops who believed the ground beneath them could not be taken by direct assault. Among the Union ranks that day stood a young officer of the 24th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment, Arthur Macarthur, Jr., also known as the dad of General John Macarthur. Not yet 20 years old, but already carrying the weight of command as adjutant and a reputation for fearless composure under fire. The morning had begun with confusion. Orders were unclear. Coordination between units was fragmented. And what had been planned as a limited demonstration against the enemy's rifle pits at the base of the ridge began to shift into something far more dangerous and unplanned. As the Union lines advanced, momentum carried them forward beyond their original objectives. The men of the 24th Wisconsin found themselves part of a widening wave of the blue uniforms pressing into increasingly exposed ground. The slope ahead, rising like a wall. Confederate artillery opened from above, and the ridge erupted into violence. Shells burst along the advancing lines, and rifle fire poured downward in the relentless volleys. The regimental colors, bright flags that marked each unit's position, became both symbols of pride and deadly targets. Color bearers fell one after another, each replacement stepping forward into almost certain death. It was in this chaos that Arthur Macarthur Jr. moved among his men, steadying them with presence rather than words, urging them forward as the attack began to lose coherence and threaten collapse. Then came the moment that would define his legacy. As the regiment surged upward in what had become a spontaneous and nearly uncontrollable charge, the color bearer was struck down. The flag of the 24th Wisconsin began to fall towards the muddy ground. Without hesitation, MacArthur pushed through the smoke and noise, seized the standard before it could touch the earth, and lifted it high above his head. In doing so, he placed himself squarely in the line of enemy fire. The flag, now unmistakably visible against the hillside sky, became a beacon and a target all at once. "On, Wisconsin!" he said to have shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of battle. Whether as a rallying cry or an instinctive burst of determination, the words cut through the confusion of the assault. Men around him saw the regimental colors still advancing and, seeing their young adjutant carrying them forward, followed without hesitation. The slope of Missionary Ridge was steep and unforgiving. Soldiers scrambled upward in small groups, stopping only briefly to fire before pressing onward again. The original battle plan had dissolved entirely. What remained was a mass of individual acts of courage stitched together by momentum and necessity. Arthur MacArthur continued upward, the flag held firmly as bullets snapped past him and struck the ground and trees along the advancing line. At moments, the ascent seemed impossible. Entire sections of the regiment faltered under concentrated fire. Yet, the sight of the colors continuing upward, held aloft by a figure now clearly visible to friend and foe alike, helped sustain the attack. In later recollection of the battle, soldiers would describe the flag's movement as a kind of anchor in the chaos, a point of reference amid smoke and confusion that kept the assault from dissolving completely. As the 24th Wisconsin neared the crest, the intensity of resistance briefly peaked. Confederate defenders entrenched along the ridgeline fired downward at near point-blank range. The final yards were the most brutal. Men fell in rapid succession, and the air itself seemed filled with the sound of snapping wood, tearing cloth, and shout commands lost almost immediately to gunfire. MacArthur reached the crest at a critical moment in the engagement, planting the regimental flag firmly into the ground at the ridgeline. He marked the hard-won position of his unit. That act, simple in motion but profound in effect, signaled that the regiment had broken through to the top of what had been considered an unassailable position. Around him, other Union soldiers surged onto the ridge, and the Confederate line began to give way under the pressure of the broader assault. The moment was fleeting but decisive. What had begun as an uncoordinated push evolved into a sweeping breakthrough along Missionary Ridge, contributing to the collapse of the Confederate defensive line outside of Chattanooga. For MacArthur, though, the experience was both physical and yet symbolic. Exhaustion, shock, and the sudden realization that The impossible had just been done, not by plan, but by momentum, courage, and sheer persistence in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. In the aftermath of the battle, accounts of the charge spread quickly. Soldiers who had witnessed the ascent spoke of the young adjutant with the flag, his figure visible against the smoke as he climbed the ridge. The phrase, "On Wisconsin," became tied to that moment of ascent, and Macarthur himself became associated with it in regimental memory. Though the broader battle involved thousands of men in multiple units, individual acts like this stood out sharply in recollection, especially in a fight defined by its sudden and improvised nature. The story of that day would follow him long after the war ended, whether fully accurate in every detail or shaped by the passage of memory and retelling. The image endured, a young officer in the midst of chaos, seizing the fallen colors of his regiment and carrying them up a deadly slope toward an enemy-held ridge. It was a moment that captured the spirit of the assault on Missionary Ridge. Disorder transforming into breakthrough, confusion into momentum, and individual courage blending into collective memory.